Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a retired marine engineer discovers a mysterious garage built on his secluded lakefront property, he uncovers a web of lies, fraud, and forged documents spun by a power-hungry HOA. What begins as a boundary dispute quickly erupts into an all-out war for truth, land, and justice. The day started like most Saturdays on my lakefront property. Quiet, fog curling off the water, a thermos of black coffee warming my hand, and the occasional cry of a heron sweeping low across the tree line. I had 11 acres of private land to myself, bordering the east edge of Silver Pines, a shiny HOA suburb with too many rules and too little personality. The lake, which technically belonged entirely to me, curved lazily around the property like a natural moat, and for years I had let the folks from the HOA dip their toes or launch kayaks without ever making a fuss. They acted like it was their secret shared treasure. I acted like I didn't notice. Until now. That morning, I was supervising a drone team I'd hired for a full GPS resurvey. I work as a land surveyor these days, retired marine engineer turned dirt and boundaries guy. I was prepping to lease a slice of my woodland to a wildlife documentary crew and wanted everything sharp on record before the lawyers started sniffing. As I walked the southern edge of the tree line, one of the drone operators, a sharp-eyed 20-something named Luca, called out from the mobile monitor station. "Hey, Mr. Dell, you expecting a building down by the South Dock Trail?" I frowned. "What building?" He spun the monitor toward me and pointed to the screen. The drone was hovering just over a thick stand of fir trees, and there, like some industrial tumor growing out of the forest floor, stood a metal building. It looked new, 30 by 40 feet maybe, green-painted corrugated steel, gabled roof. It wasn't in any of my records. It sure as hell wasn't in my memory. I stared at the feed, then back out toward the tree line. "You guys stay here," I said. "I'll check it out." The hike down to that section took me about 10 minutes. It was an area I hadn't touched in months, a low spot with poor drainage and no real trail. When I broke through the underbrush, there it was, just as the drone showed, a full-blown garage, set back about 40 feet from the property line, nestled behind a screen of trees. I walked the perimeter slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. The thing had a reinforced concrete slab, floodlights mounted on each corner, a keypad entry system next to a heavy steel door, and a thick electrical conduit running from the rear and disappearing into the brush, headed straight toward Silver Pines. I stood there for a full minute, processing. I hadn't authorized any construction. I hadn't signed a lease. I hadn't even seen a single vehicle or contractor near this side of the property in over a year. I walked around to the back. No windows. But on the side, facing the trees, were shelves visible through a narrow ventilation slit. Gardening tools, weed trimmers, plastic bins. I squinted. Some had HOA stickers on them. My pulse started climbing. I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff's department. Then I walked back to the door, took a photo of the lock and keypad, and stood back. A voice startled me. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I turned to see a man in his late 40s stomping through the brush from the Silver Pine side. Khakis. Polo, HOA energy dripping off him like sweat. I raised my phone. "Just called the sheriff." He stopped cold. "Why?" "Because someone built a damn warehouse on my land." He scoffed. "That's not your land. That's community space." I walked a little closer and gestured to the ground. "Buddy, I've owned this property since I buried my father up the hill. This entire lake, the woods, the soil under your precious grass, all mine. And now there's a building on it that wasn't here 6 months ago." He crossed his arms. "That garage is part of our community utility plan, built last spring. It's on file with the HOA. It's not on file with the county," I snapped. "It's not on file with me." "You're about to be on file with the sheriff." He snorted and pulled out his phone, pacing in tight, angry circles while pretending to talk to someone important. I turned back to the keypad. The lock was high grade, but I spotted a rusted hasp where a padlock used to hang. Backup entry, maybe. I walked back to the barn, fired up my generator, and grabbed an angle grinder. If they wanted to play construction games, I'd bring tools. By the time the sheriff arrived, I had already cut through the padlock, cracked open the door, and stepped inside. It smelled like fertilizer and gasoline. There were 6 rows of steel shelves, a stack of propane tanks, a riding mower, and several large wheeled bins labeled Silver Pines HOA Event Storage. A camera mounted in the corner turned with a faint click as I walked past. Sheriff Henders stepped in behind me. He was a no-nonsense type I'd worked with on a few survey disputes in the past. He took one look around, exhaled through his nose, and said, "Well, this is going to be fun." I handed him the drone footage, photos, and my most recent property line documents. "Tell me this doesn't look like someone dropped a barn on private land and hoped no one would notice." He nodded slowly. "Looks that way." "Then tell me how they got away with it." He didn't answer. By the time the HOA rep slunk back through the trees, flanked by two more of his type, I was already filing a formal trespass complaint. That evening, I cracked a beer and sat on my dock, watching the sun go down behind the garage that wasn't supposed to exist. I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The email came at 8:30 the next morning, and it was every bit as unhinged as I'd come to expect from the HOA crowd. The subject line read, in bold all caps, "Notice of property violation and damages. Urgent response required." It was from the office of Silver Pines Homeowners Association, addressed to me like I was one of their dues-paying minions. I wasn't, and never had been. The body of the message was a mix of legalese and passive-aggressive nonsense. Apparently, by unlawfully breaching their utility facility, yes, they were now referring to the illegal garage on my land as a utility facility, I had caused irreparable damage to community property, interfered with operational systems, and engaged in unauthorized and aggressive actions against association assets. They were demanding compensation, $68,500 for the repair and restoration of their garage. They even included a line-itemized breakdown, $4,000 for lock mechanism replacement, $22,000 for equipment decontamination, $12,000 for security system damage, and a whopping $30,000 under the delightful category of legal and reputational damages. Reputational, as if I'd graffitied a church. I stared at the screen for a solid minute, then forwarded the whole thing to my attorney, Ellen Price, with the subject line, "You're gonna love this." Then I brewed the strongest cup of coffee I could manage and started digging. By midday, I had copies of the latest parcel maps from the county assessor's office. I had high-resolution aerial images from the past 3 years, clearly showing that nothing existed on that land until 6 months ago. I had GPS data from the drone flights. I had copies of my deed, zoning certificates, and even my father's handwritten land use journal from 20 years back. If they wanted to play property games, I came armed. Around 3 in the afternoon, while I was reviewing electrical permitting records online, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail, then curiosity got the better of me, and I hit play. "Mr. Dell," came a clipped, condescending voice. "This is Karen Miller, president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. I understand there was a bit of confusion yesterday. I think it would be best if we had a calm discussion before things escalate. If you're reasonable, I'm sure we can find a solution that benefits everyone. Please call me back by end of day, and do refrain from further destruction of community property in the meantime." The nerve of this woman. I didn't call her back. Instead, I decided to pay a little visit to the county planning office in person. When I walked in and gave my name, the clerk perked up like she recognized the storm that was brewing. She fetched a file, flipped through it nervously, and finally handed me a copy of what she called a shared boundary adjustment request, dated 6 months prior. There, in black and white, was a modification to the servitude map showing the southernmost 40 feet of my land, as a revised community easement zone for HOA maintenance structures. The document had a forged signature on it, supposedly, from a retired surveyor named Greg Powell. I knew Greg. He'd been dead for 2 years. I took a photo of the form, copied the seal, and filed a formal complaint with the county registrar. The clerk promised to expedite the review, which I translated in my head to, "This is above her pay grade and will take weeks." Still, it was something. That night, a manila envelope was taped to my front gate. Inside, a printout of the same violation letter from the email, along with a bright red final notice, warning me that failure to pay the $68,500 would result in further action, including liens, public complaint, filings, and legal pursuit. They were threatening to lien my property over a building they had constructed on land they didn't own. I drove to the back edge of my property just after sundown, parked by the garage, and stood there a long moment in the half-light. The floodlights flicked on automatically. The place looked sterile, expensive, smug, a monument to boundary-pushing entitlement. I walked a slow circle around it again, like I was studying a dead thing. The cameras still tracked me. I smiled and flipped one of them off. Then I planted a new sign directly in front of the door, bold white letters on matte black. Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. The next morning, someone had sprayed community space across it in orange paint. I didn't sleep that night. Not well anyway. My mind kept replaying the same image. Greg Powell's name printed under a shaky signature on a county document dated 6 months after his funeral. Greg was an old-school surveyor, crusty as a barnacle and twice as stubborn, but the man knew land law like scripture. The idea that someone would drag his dead name into this HOA circus was grotesque. By morning, I'd made my decision. I drove straight to Ellen Price's office in town and dropped the packet of documents on her desk. She was already on her second coffee and raised an eyebrow at the mess of maps, photos, and HOA letters. They forged a boundary adjustment using a dead man's signature, I said. I want to bury them. Ellen scanned the top page, then sat back slowly. This isn't a zoning mistake. This is fraud. No kidding. She called in her paralegal, and they started assembling a formal case file. By noon, we had drafted the preliminary paperwork for a cease and desist order, a motion for injunctive relief, and a request for a full investigation into the forged plat submission. Ellen also filed a property title defense to freeze any attempt by the HOA to file liens against my land. Meanwhile, I headed back to the county assessor's office. This time, I wasn't alone. I brought in a private GIS contractor, someone I'd worked with on a timberland boundary dispute years ago, a guy named Collins, sharp as hell and not afraid to piss off local bureaucrats. We sat down with the deputy recorder and demanded to see the chain of custody on the servitude amendment. The deputy hesitated, clearly sweating the politics of it all, but eventually pulled up the scanned version of the document. There it was, a clean scanned PDF with a digital seal, a date stamp, and Greg Powell's name typed under the signature line. But the signature itself, it was a perfect copy of Greg's signature from a 2004 subdivision dispute, the same one that had appeared in a public record I digitized years ago. This is a digital paste job, Collins said, pointing at the irregular pixelation. Whoever filed this downloaded a copy of Greg's old plat report and cut the signature straight out of it. The deputy recorder turned pale. I didn't know. Who submitted it? I asked. He hesitated. It came through a private courier from the HOA's land use liaison, Karen Miller's office. There it was. I walked out of that office with certified copies of everything. Ellen's team would be submitting them to the court that afternoon. But I wasn't done. When I got back home, I started compiling my own dossier. Drone footage, historical surveys, public satellite maps, screenshots of county GIS overlays, my original deed, utility easement maps, and a signed affidavit from Greg's widow stating that he'd been dead for over a year when the supposed amendment was filed. Then I opened Facebook. I wasn't much of a poster, but I had a handful of friends in town, and word of the HOA's garage had started circulating. Karen's people had launched a PR blitz, sappy photos of children fishing on their beloved community lake, tear-jerking posts about how Mr. Dell was trying to cut us off from our shared green space, and even a petition with over 100 digital signatures demanding that I honor the spirit of neighborhood unity. I didn't respond directly. Instead, I created a new page titled Lakefront Lies, The Truth About Silver Pines HOA. On it, I posted aerial footage of the garage from before and after its construction, a side-by-side comparison of the forged and original plat documents, a red line overlay showing the real property boundary, a slow zoom in on the forged signature of Greg Powell, captioned, filed 6 months after Greg passed away. Within 24 hours, the post had been shared over 300 times. That evening, a reporter from Channel 8 News knocked on my gate. She'd seen the page and wanted a comment. I gave her the full story, on camera, standing right in front of the metal garage. This structure, I said, tapping the wall, is a monument to arrogance, fraud, and the assumption that if someone builds fast enough and lies hard enough, no one will stop them. The HOA's response was almost immediate. The very next morning, they emailed Ellen's office claiming that I had doctored the evidence myself, that the garage had been approved by emergency vote, and that the petition to seize the easement had been submitted by mistake, later ratified by implied consent. Implied consent. They were inventing legal fantasy in real time. Later that day, I caught one of their contractors poking around the woods near the garage. He claimed he was inspecting drainage. I escorted him to the edge of my property and told him that next time he'd be met by a deputy. The standoff had officially begun. I woke up the next morning to a flood of emails, missed calls, and one particularly poetic death threat via HOA Facebook Messenger that involved cement shoes and the lake. Seemed the PR battle had entered a new phase, but I wasn't rattled. I had bigger things to do. By 8 a.m., Ellen's office had filed the cease and desist order with the county court, along with the supporting documents, sworn affidavits, forensic analysis of the forged signature, county GIS data, and video footage from my drone survey. We didn't just want the garage removed, we wanted it classified as unlawful encroachment with criminal investigation into fraud and property tampering. But even that wasn't enough anymore. I'd spent the last 2 weeks being treated like the villain on my own land, and I wasn't going to let the HOA rewrite reality. That afternoon, I stood on my dock and launched the drone myself. This time, I wasn't just capturing the garage, I was mapping the entire lakefront in ultra-high resolution. I flew the drone low and slow, panning across the shoreline, showing the boundary stakes I'd hammered in years ago, the rusted chain demarcating the old trailhead, even the plaque dedicated to my grandfather, still bolted to the maple tree near the western edge. Then I edited the footage into a 5-minute narrated video where I laid out the whole thing: the fake map, the dead surveyor, the illegal structure, the attempted lien. I called it How to Steal a Lake, a masterclass in HOA overreach. I posted it on the Lakefront Lies page, along with the caption, "They built a garage on my land. Then they fined me for entering it. Now they want the lake too." The post exploded. By evening, it had over 10,000 views. Local news stations started calling, and suddenly I wasn't just a grumpy landowner with a grudge. I was the guy fighting the HOA mafia, the kind of story people love. David versus suburban Goliath. Silver Pines didn't take it well. Karen's office released a public statement calling me a destabilizing element in the community, accusing me of targeted harassment, and suggesting I had ulterior financial motives. Some HOA members even claimed I was planning to sell the land to developers to build high-rise condos on the lakefront, despite my very public commitment to keeping the area protected as conservation land. They were spinning hard, but it didn't matter. The video had sparked a fire. Residents from other HOA-run neighborhoods across the state began commenting on my page, sharing their own horror stories: power-tripping presidents, forged votes, secret spending. One former Silver Pines resident DM'd me a copy of an internal newsletter from last year showing that Karen had quietly authorized a community development fund without member approval. The fund, nearly $200,000. Destination: amenities expansion. A few of those amenities now appeared to be sitting in that garage. Ellen's paralegal dug deeper and confirmed it. The HOA had paid for the garage construction using reserve funds. No vote, no contractor bid transparency, no recorded motion in HOA minutes. The contractor they used? A shell company linked to Karen's cousin out of Eugene. I brought the receipts straight to Channel 8. The next night, my face was on the local evening news, standing in front of the steel garage, pointing at the camera like I was running for sheriff. I laid it out in plain terms. This building was constructed on private property without permission, using HOA funds that were never authorized. Now they're trying to punish me for defending my own land. They lied to the county, forged documents, and smeared my name in public. This isn't about one man and a shed. This is about abuse of power. The fallout was fast and ugly. Residents in Silver Pines started asking questions. Several posted online about dues being raised last spring without explanation. One woman claimed she'd been fined for having unapproved potted plants, while the HOA board apparently funneled thousands into a garage hidden in the woods. Then someone leaked meeting minutes showing that Karen had labeled my land a long-term strategic acquisition in internal discussions. Her words. A few days later, a protest formed near the HOA office building. Signs, chants, even a guy in a bear costume holding a placard that read, "Bear with us, we want our dues back." Karen naturally went silent. That weekend, I hosted a press conference on my property, set up folding chairs near the dock, brought in reporters, and answered every question they threw at me. I handed out packets with all the documents, marked, dated, and cross-referenced. By the end, I had the county commissioner himself on the phone asking if I'd be willing to speak at a regulatory hearing. I told him I'd be delighted, but while the press was having a field day, something else was stirring. On Sunday night, while I was reviewing emails, the driveway alert sensor triggered. I checked the camera feed. A white SUV idled at the end of my private road, lights off, no plates visible. It sat there for a full 7 minutes before reversing back into the woods. That same night, someone keyed the words "community trader" into the tailgate of my truck. I filed a report with the sheriff, but I didn't stop filming. I installed motion sensor lights, added backup generators for the cameras, and set up a remote drive with auto upload, because if they wanted a war, they'd pick the wrong damn guy. The sheriff's deputy who took my report about the truck vandalism was polite but non-committal. "Could be teenagers," he said with a shrug. "You know how things get when emotions run high." "Yeah," I replied, especially when those emotions are being stoked by HOA-funded Facebook rants and neighborhood whisper campaigns. He took a few notes, snapped a photo of my tailgate, and left. I wasn't expecting much. I didn't need them to solve the mystery, I just needed it on record in case the HOA decided to get bolder, which of course, they did. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel, a cease and desist order. According to them, I was guilty of ongoing defamation, trespassing, and unauthorized surveillance of HOA property. The language was ridiculous, but there it was. They were accusing me of illegally filming their members, unlawfully accessing community infrastructure, and slandering the board in public forums. The cherry on top? They demanded that I remove the drone footage from all social media platforms, issue a public apology to the Silver Pines HOA, and pay damages in the amount of $68,500. I laughed out loud reading it. Then I handed the letter to Ellen, who didn't laugh at all. "This is a setup," she said. "They're trying to flip the narrative, make you look like the aggressor. It's a smokescreen, intimidation, and a very bad bluff." So we escalated. Ellen filed a countersuit, civil action for fraudulent land appropriation, forgery of legal documents, unauthorized construction, and intentional infliction of reputational harm. We also filed a motion requesting a temporary injunction barring any HOA representatives from entering my property pending the outcome of the case. But the HOA wasn't slowing down. They doubled down. That weekend, one of my dock cameras picked up a new crew of men arriving at the garage in the early morning hours. They wore generic uniforms, no visible company name. They unlocked the garage and began hauling out equipment, landscaping tools, a new power generator, sealed containers labeled community materials. It looked like they were clearing the place out, covering their tracks. I forwarded the footage to Ellen. Then I called the sheriff's office and demanded they send someone immediately. This time, they did. Deputy Rankin, a younger guy with a decent head on his shoulders, arrived within 20 minutes. I showed him the footage. He raised an eyebrow at the timestamp. "They shouldn't be moving anything," he said, "especially not with a pending injunction." He radioed it in, and within the hour, another cruiser rolled in. They confronted the crew, who claimed they were authorized HOA contractors performing emergency maintenance, but they had no paperwork, no ID, just a handwritten note allegedly signed by Karen Miller. The deputies shut them down on the spot. But that little incident gave us a new angle. Ellen amended the suit to include evidence tampering and attempted destruction of disputed assets. Still, I knew Karen. She wasn't going to back off. She was going to fight this all the way down and take the HOA with her, if that's what it cost. And so the real war began. The next Monday, I received an anonymous packet in the mail. No return address. Inside were printed screenshots from HOA internal message boards, posts from Karen and other board members planning a media counteroffensive. They referred to me as the saboteur and floated tactics ranging from anonymous op-eds to fake social media accounts designed to undermine his credibility. One message from a user named KM Miller Exec actually said we should leak that he was dishonorably discharged from the Navy. I wasn't. I retired with commendation after 18 years at sea, but facts didn't matter to people like Karen. Control did. I sent the packet to Ellen. She grimaced and shook her head. "They're desperate," she said, "and sloppy." This is the kind of crap that makes judges furious. That same week, a public forum was held at the County Administrative Hall. I showed up, armed with documents, maps, a portable projector, and about 30 pages of notarized evidence. The room was packed. half HOA members, half reporters, and a few quiet faces I recognized from town council. Karen was there too, seated in the front row, her arms crossed like a school principal watching a misbehaving student. She didn't speak. Not once. I gave my presentation calmly, point by point, laying out the timeline of encroachment, the forgery, the garage construction, the misappropriation of funds. I handed out a printed binder to every council member with tabs and cross-references. By the time I finished, the silence was deafening. One of the council members finally spoke. "Mr. Dell, are you prepared to submit all this to the court under penalty of perjury?" "Yes," I said, "every page." Karen left the room without a word. 2 days later, I got a message from one of the younger HOA board members, a guy named Lucas, who'd always seemed uncomfortable in meetings. He wanted to talk. Off record. We met at a coffee shop outside of town. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Karen's been hiding financials," he said, "even from the board. I tried to bring it up last month, and she told me to shut it down or resign." He slid a flash drive across the table. "These are the original invoices for the garage. Payments were made from a secondary account. No vote, no board approval." I took the drive and nodded. "You just became my star witness." Lucas's flash drive was a goldmine. Inside were scanned checks, emails, internal HOA memos, and an Excel sheet labeled Community Enhancements Discretionary. The garage was listed under a line item called Temporary Storage for Shared Resources, with 3 separate payments made. Over 4 months, all issued from an account not disclosed in HOA public records. The payee, Oak Ridge Rural Development Group, LLC. A quick business registry search revealed the company's owner, Thomas Miller, Karen's nephew. We didn't waste time. Ellen added 2 new charges to the lawsuit: fraudulent misappropriation of HOA funds and undisclosed self-dealing. It was getting heavy. She also filed a motion to subpoena Karen's emails and the HOA board's internal financial records. The judge, seeing the mounting evidence and the whistleblower's cooperation, granted it. Then, like dominoes, things started to fall. A week later, the county land office responded to our formal inquiry about the servitude map amendment, the one Karen had filed to shift my boundary 40 feet into the woods. Turns out, the document's certifying officer had retired 2 years before the form was allegedly signed. The digital signature was a copy-paste job, pixel-perfect, identical to one on a permit from 2017. County fraud investigators opened a formal case. Karen must have felt the walls closing in because she panicked. The HOA sent another mass email to residents, calling me a menace to public safety, accusing me of trying to sow discord and undermine community cohesion. They framed my lawsuit as a personal vendetta, complete with selective screenshots and heavily edited drone images, cropped to remove the boundary flags and stakes I'd installed. But people weren't buying it anymore. The video I'd posted earlier passed 50,000 views. Local media ran follow-ups. The HOA subreddit picked it up, and it went viral with the title, "This guy just exposed an HOA president committing land fraud. It's glorious." I got calls from 3 different investigative journalists, one from a national paper. One even offered to fly in for an interview and aerial shoot. I declined. I didn't want a circus. I wanted justice. Then, in a moment of either staggering arrogance or complete mental collapse, Karen made her worst move yet. She filed a countercomplaint alleging I had intentionally falsified property records and, this was the wild part, had moved my own boundary markers to make it seem like the garage was on my land. She even included blurry photos taken from a neighbor's backyard showing me near the tree line, holding survey tape. It was laughable. I had timestamps, GPS logs, and certified contractor statements. Ellen nearly burst a blood vessel laughing when she read the filing. "This is beyond desperation," she said. "This is self-immolation." And then came the audit. One of the HOA's own board members, perhaps smelling smoke, triggered an internal financial review. It wasn't public at first, but by then, leaks were flowing like beer at a barbecue. Turns out the discretionary fund Karen had been operating wasn't just for the garage. There were entries for travel expenses with no destination listed, consulting services paid to shell companies, and a recurring charge labeled HOA Vision Initiative that no one on the board could explain. When the full audit report was leaked online, it sent shockwaves through the community. Karen had spent over $270,000 of HOA funds in the last year without any documented board approval, HOA members were furious. One of them, an older woman named Janice, stood up at the next meeting and demanded Karen's immediate resignation. "You spent more on a hidden garage than on road maintenance in 3 years," she shouted. "You lied to all of us." Karen didn't respond. She left the room. By now, the courthouse date was locked in. We had 2 weeks until the preliminary hearing. Ellen prepped her case like a veteran going into battle. Lucas agreed to testify under oath. We had the documents, the video, the audit, the boundary confirmation from the county surveyor, and the newly opened fraud investigation. It was almost too perfect, which is when things got dark. The night after the audit leak, someone cut the power to my entire property. Not just a blackout, someone physically tampered with the junction box outside the main road. My security lights went down. The cameras auto-switched to battery backup, but only caught a glimpse of a figure in a hoodie walking away from the panel. It was clearly sabotage. I called the sheriff again. This time, they took it seriously. A deputy came out, took photos, and agreed to flag my property for extra patrols. I installed a secondary solar array the next morning, hooked to a separate off-grid system. If they thought they could spook me, they were decades too late. The next day, Karen's attorney filed a request to delay the hearing. The judge denied it. The courthouse smelled like old paper and floor wax. It was a cloudy Wednesday, and I sat outside the hearing room in a pressed shirt and clean jeans, sipping burnt coffee and waiting for war. Ellen was calm, controlled, her briefcase neatly stacked with color-coded tabs and binders. She looked like a corporate assassin. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by 2 lawyers and trailed by a fidgety HOA board member. Her face was stone. No makeup, no smile, just that same sour glare she wore like a badge. Inside the courtroom, things moved quickly. The judge, an older woman with no patience for theatrics, asked both sides to stick to facts. Ellen stood and laid everything out like a surgeon. Boundary maps, satellite images, official county records, timestamps, even the invoice trail from Oak Ridge Rural Development. She introduced Lucas as our first witness. Lucas sat down, adjusted his tie, and began talking. Calm, factual, reluctantly honest. He explained how Karen had funded the garage without a board vote, how the invoices were funneled through a shell company, how the board had been misled. When Ellen asked whether he was pressured to keep quiet, he nodded. "She told me if I made noise, I'd be out." Karen's lawyer objected. The judge waved it off. Then came the county official from the land office, who confirmed the servitude map was fake, signed under a name that hadn't been employed in over 2 years. The signature had been cut and pasted from a 2017 zoning document. Fraud, plain and simple. Karen's team scrambled. They tried to argue that the garage sat in a disputed zone, that Max had never put up a formal fence, that the land was practically shared. The judge wasn't impressed. "I've seen clearer property lines in mud," she said. Next. Then it was my turn. I testified about the discovery, the garage, the cameras, the threats, the sabotage. Ellen showed the footage. The judge asked questions. I answered everything calmly, cleanly. No theatrics, just facts. Karen didn't take the stand. Her lawyers likely knew better, but they submitted a last-minute motion, a claim that I'd orchestrated the entire scandal to destroy the HOA. The judge rolled her eyes. Denied. After a brief recess, she returned with a ruling. The garage was illegal construction on private land. The forged map constituted criminal fraud. HOA funds were misused. Damages awarded to me, $1,400,000. The HOA was ordered to dismantle the garage within 30 days and return the property to its original condition. But the kicker came last. The judge handed a sealed envelope to a bailiff. He nodded and walked toward Karen. "Ms. Miller, you are hereby remanded to custody pending formal charges of document forgery and financial fraud." Karen didn't speak. She didn't resist. She just blinked twice and let the cuffs close around her wrists. As they walked her out, I finally exhaled. It was over. The garage came down on a Tuesday morning. 3 trucks, a demolition crew, and a county officer stood by as men with drills and crowbars dismantled every panel. It took less than 6 hours. By evening, all that was left was a muddy rectangle of flattened earth and a pile of splintered boards. I stood on the ridge above, arms crossed, watching the cleanup in silence. No speeches, no neighbors. Just the wind and the sound of power tools finally doing the right thing. The compensation came in 2 installments, one from the HOA's liability fund, the other from Karen's personal bond, now frozen as part of the criminal investigation. Ellen said it was one of the fastest enforcement actions she'd ever seen in her career. Karen was charged with multiple counts of document forgery, misuse of public funds, and conspiracy to defraud. Her trial was scheduled for the fall. The prosecutor aimed for a sentence of 8 to 10 years. The HOA began to fracture almost immediately. At the next community meeting, 3 board members resigned. Someone stood up and motioned to dissolve the entire association. Cheers followed. A petition went out that same night, and within 48 hours, it had enough signatures to force a vote. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. I had what mattered. I filed for environmental protection status on the land along my shoreline, an old clause buried in the state code that preserved private land while limiting development around it. The designation went through within weeks. Now the lake and its banks were not just mine, but protected by law from encroachment. I installed a new aluminum fence, solar-powered cameras with redundant backups, and a simple, bold sign at the trailhead. Private lakefront, not for Joe use. Trespassers will be prosecuted. It wasn't personal, it was permanent. People started treating me differently after that. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years stopped by just to shake my hand. One guy from down the hill brought me a bottle of whiskey and said, "You did what we all wish we had the guts to do." I didn't feel like a hero. I felt tired. But there was a kind of peace in knowing I'd drawn a line and held it. One morning, months later, I took my old canoe out on the lake. The water was still. The sky was clean. I paddled to the center and just drifted for a while, staring back at the trees. No garages, no boundary fights, no HOA. Just my land and the silence I had earned.